Mind. Okay, so today I want to talk about rights. I want to talk about not necessarily rights in a philosophical or a legal context, because that's not what we deal with in debate. We deal with rights in a debate context. So first I want to talk about the origin of rights as you're going to be able to most accessibly get to them. Because what I want to give you is kind of a framework through which you can examine any rights debate from either side at any time, so that you can stand up there and sound like a smart person, even if you have no idea what you're actually talking about and have never done any kind of serious philosophy before. So the first thing to keep in mind about rights is where they come from. They're a fundamentally human concept. They are decided by human beings, they are defined by human beings, they are applied to human beings, and they are applied by human beings. So stay away from the trap of absolutism, like stay away from the bad political rhetoric about God-given rights and fundamental rights and stuff like that. All rights are fundamentally defined by human beings. They're all things that we access as human beings, and so you should deal with them in a realistic context. Realize that accessibility of rights is important in addition to their very existence. So much as quoting things like the Charter and the Constitution and the UN Declaration of Human Rights are useful, they're not necessarily anything that's going to further an argument, because you still need to prove how those rights are going to interact with people on the ground in their day-to-day lives and how it applies to them. So you need to be making sure that you're actually defining rights in ways that are useful for the debate world as well as for the real world. So let's talk about why we have rights. Because given that they are defined by their context, that people just define them, I think that a lot of people get afraid that rights are something that doesn't really exist. But there are rules to how rights are made, there are rules to how rights are governed, and I think that those are the more important aspects of getting into rights rather than what particular wordings someone has said you have a right to in the past. So the first concept for why we have rights is to balance power, is because we recognize that there are people with power in our society and there are people that don't have it. The thing is that rights aren't always just a balancing act of the powerful getting neutered by the weak. There are actually a lot of rights that exist to protect people with power in those moments of weakness when they have them. Because one of the realizations that came with rights was that people can transfer very quickly from someone who has a lot of power to someone who doesn't have any. Because of that transfer, people need to have rights whether they are the strong, whether they are the weak. Rights is about coming together and forming a mutually beneficial framework and a mutually beneficial agreement. It's things that help everyone. The moment that you start having rights that are really targeted and try to attack people or that arbitrarily distinguish between people, you're degrading that entire mutual benefit relationship that you want to have from them. So you want to have them be broadly beneficial. You want them to be things that are not very arbitrary. You want rights, obviously, to be directed. Rights that are very vague aren't particularly useful. It's good to have strong definitions of rights that target them towards particular people. But they shouldn't be arbitrarily targeted. They shouldn't be targeted because we don't like you or because we especially like you. They should be directed in the sense that these kind of people need protection, or these kind of people have sufficient entitlements, we don't need to give them more. It's looking at things not in terms of direct categories, but in terms of commonalities between human conditions. So whether you're poor or strong, whether you're rich, is probably a better one to put in that dichotomy. Whether you're poor or rich, there are still commonalities of humanity that go between the two of you. And so your rights should be looking at finding those commonalities and making sure that those commonalities are as best protected as possible. At the same time, making sure that you're looking for the ways that each individual is unique from others, and making sure that those uniquenesses are also protected. Not necessarily as this particular uniqueness is protected, but all uniquenesses are protected. And that gives you a kind of introduction to the liberal framework of rights. So next I want to look at some of the aspects of rights, things that are very important to recognize when you're arguing about them. The first one is the concept of blindness. This is effectively the continuation of non-arbitrary rights, is that they should be directed, but they should not be targeted. The real reason why you have blindness is the recognition that whether or not you are in power or not in power is a situation that wasn't necessarily decided by you or anything that you've done. In large part, it's by random lottery of birth. It's by what kind of situation, what kind of context did you arrive into the world in is going to fundamentally change the way you interact with the world later on in your life. So even though you might have been born with a silver spoon in your mouth, that doesn't give you any kind of extra privileges, because you just as equally could have been born in a slum in Mumbai or something like that. There is no real vast grand plan that is acting on you. You suddenly arrived there by chance, and that is why rights should be created in a blind fashion. It's why, for instance, slavery is bad. Because much as you as the master has the ability to change the slave's life, the only reason that you're the master and not the slave was arbitrary chance. So you don't really have any justification for taking away their rights, especially when you consider that you are equally as human as them and could just as equally be in their position. By creating rights or by destroying rights and discriminating against people, you are opening up the ways in which you discriminate against yourself because you're attacking other human beings. So that's the basics behind the blindness principle. It's that you shouldn't attack people, you shouldn't discriminate because of the situation where you are there by chance, not by any act of your own. The next one is knowledge, is that all rights should be designed to be accessible. Is that one of the problems, for instance, with writing up contracts is that you come into this situation where some people have a greater understanding of the consequences of that contract than do other people. So when you have that imbalance of knowledge, you have to be able to address that within your rights framework. Are your rights accessible? Is it something that anyone can go out there and actually have access to? Or can you only access this right through a very labyrinthian way of getting about to it, and you don't actually know what your right is, you don't understand what your right means, because it is so complicated and so strange and so dependent on specific knowledge. Rights that depend on that should be avoided. So a lot of stuff in a legal context is very bad because your rights are so ambiguous that no one understands what's going on other than the lawyers that wrote them. It's one of the serious problems with how laws are constructed and why it's very important to have things like juries so that people can actually have laws applied to them in ways that are understandable to them. It's one of the main justifications for having juries is simply that otherwise laws would become so complicated that no one would know what they're being tried for anymore. So by having juries, it forces the legal system to say, oh, wait a second, there's an imbalance of knowledge in our understanding of our rights, and therefore we need to make sure that we're constantly addressing that imbalance of knowledge by making sure that laws are accessible to people. Does that kind of make sense? It's something that only happens in a couple rounds, but it's something that's very important to remember. The final one is balance of power. This is why you get things like protection of minority rights. It's where the term tyranny of the majority comes from. It's that people have imbalances of power. There are people that have the ability to make decisions that affect other people. So when you are in that position of power, it's actually very important to look back and think, okay, first and foremost, do I have the right to exercise this power? And this comes back to the idea of blindness. Is this a power that I'm only exercising because of some arbitrary distinction? Or is this some kind of power that is given to me by a general will of society, or a general will of knowledge, or general will of logic, or something like that? So do I have the right to do this? The second part is, who am I affecting? Am I only affecting the people that I'm directing this right towards? Or am I creating ripple effects? Am I going to cause knock-on effects? Am I going to, by, for instance, creating legislations about how wide hospital hallways are going to have to be, deny people the ability to get necessary medical treatments because it closes down specialized clinics? See abortion.